Hi, I'm Chuck Corey, and I will be discussing how the United States is falling behind the rest of the world, um, or at least first world developed nations, in the race for sustainability. But before I can really begin to discuss how they're falling behind and how other countries are doing sustainable actions, I should first describe why sustainability is a topic worthy of global concern. Well, as human technology advances and our population grows, we put more strain on the Earth and come ever closer to the theoretical carrying capacity of Earth. It has also been proven without a doubt that climate change is perpetuated by the activities of humans, especially any activities which produce methane or CO2, and is increasing global surface temperatures as a result of those activities. If you look at Earth's surface temperature records studied by NOAA, it shows that 2016 was the third consecutive year in a row to break Earth's surface temperature records. So that means 14, 15, and 16 both were the hottest years ever recorded. This, along with increasing methane emissions from human activity, causes global temperature rise, combined with the destruction of natural CO2 regulators such as ocean coral life and global forest cover. Ice caps also tend to form a vicious cycle of methane release because as they melt, there are massive amounts of methane stored in the polar ice caps, and those get released in large quantities, which directly contributes to more climate change and global warming. Any statistic of importance must be able to be measured and compared. When it comes to sustainability, the Environmental Protection Index, or abbreviated as the EPI, is one of the most reliable and in-depth reports. The EPI is done every other year, and it is ran mostly by Yale University. It began in 2002. The EPI looks at two categories of country factors: environmental health and ecosystem vitality, and scores countries on a 0 to 100 scale. And then it globally ranks them from first to last to see how the world compares to each other in environmental sustainability. The graph right here shows the projected curve of the environmental health score countries receive from 2016, and the GDP, which is gross domestic product of their countries. And the graph clearly shows that there is a strong correlation of GDP and environmental health score. It's a positive relationship. Unfortunately, though, the US is an outlier here that's really not even shown on the graph because it would fall off the graph somewhere under the higher GDPs than Norway, which is at the top, but still lower environmental score. An EPI score is based off of two main categories: environmental health and ecosystem vitality. Environmental health focuses on health impacts or environmental risk exposures, so possible nuclear waste facilities that are outdated, or earthquakes would be environmental risks. Also, air quality falls under environmental health, so that directly looks at pollutants in parts per million, along with water and sanitation, which looks at how a country handles wastewater and if clean water is a available resource to the entire population. The second broad category is ecosystem vitality, which begins with water resources and will look at a country's water resource. So are they experiencing droughts like in California, or do they have enough water where people are able to water their lawns freely? Also, agriculture is a big category, and agriculture focuses on nitrogen efficiency, and total nitrogen use. Forest change percent cover, or forest cover percent change, is also a key category that falls under ecosystem vitality because forests are such a huge CO2 absorber once a year, and percent forest cover is a big factor of the air quality of a country, pretty much. Biodiversity and habitat looks at species protection, both marine and terrestrial. So if there are a lot of wildlife protected areas, or if endangered species are protected. Climate and energy looks at CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour. Here we have the 2016 EPI scores. And the top few countries are no surprise since they find themselves in the top 10 or 20 almost every time the EPI report comes out. This year, Finland scored first with 90.68, and Iceland and Sweden were both extremely close behind. Sadly, America can only be found at 26th and received a score of 84.72, which, since we like to compare ourselves so much to the other countries in Europe, it kind of shows that we're failing compared to them. Even the United Kingdom scored 12th, which is way higher than us. And at the bottom here, you can see that these are the bottom scoring countries. I only included the last couple, but you can see Somalia is in bottom. It's not probably too much of a surprise since they have almost no form of government that is stable at all. But you also see countries like Central African Republic, Myanmar, Mali, Bangladesh, Chad. And it's just clear that countries that are more developed should be scoring higher on the Environmental Protection Index. And on the last slide, we saw that EU nations, European Union nations, often score far higher on the Environmental Protection Index than the United States has been. One possible reason for that is EU policy for emissions. And the EU currently has and enforces a very strict method of cap and trade for controlling emissions known as EU ETS, which stands for European Union Emissions Trading System. The system focuses on the emissions of CO2, N2O, and PFCs. EU ETS applies to many industries across the European Union, including oil refineries, metal production, commercial airlines, any sort of factories which are emitting or have to abide by the trading in policy. And the EU sets a single-wide cap on emissions and allows companies to buy or sell emission allowances. So that means that the entire EU abides by a single emission cap, which in the multiple countries and a vast area, and all countries or all businesses in the EU are able to buy and sell emission allowances from each other. Also, the EU ETS cap is really impressive in the way that it reduces the cap every year. So emissions are constantly being deducted and lowered and creating a healthier environment. Also, the way it's formed allows for the expansion of it to cover more gases as more greenhouse gases are discovered or more gases are labeled dangerous in the environment, as well as it can cover more industries. So any industries that are not currently forced to be part of the EU ETS can be brought in. To get a better understanding of what type of countries make it into the top scoring EPI nations so often, we can break down some of the demographics and economy statistics of the top three. So here we have Finland, which scored first, Iceland, and Sweden. And Finland, we'll start with, in 2016, has a GDP of $230 billion, which was an increase from their 2015 GDP of $2 to $7.9 billion. They also have an unemployment rate of 9.1% in 2016 and 9.3% in 2015. Their population size is 5,498,000, and on the federal budget for education, or federal expenditures on education, are a total of 7.2% of their GDP, which, if calculated out, is about 16.56 billion. Also, their federal government total spending budget per year is about 132.7 billion. In Iceland, which scored second, their GDP was only 16.15 billion in the year 2016, which is a heavy drop from Finland, which kind of shows that maybe GDP isn't such a key indicator of a country's EPI score. Also, their employment rate was 2.7, so it's a very, very low percentage in 2016, and which is dropped from their 4% in 2015. Iceland also has a much smaller population, with a total of only 335,000 people, and their education expenditures by the federal government were 7.8% of the GDP, which, if calculated, is also 1.259 billion. And also their total federal budget for the year 2016 was 7.79 billion. Sweden, on the other hand, is a much bigger nation than both of them, and had a GDP of 498.1 billion in 2016, which is an increase from their $481 billion GDP in 2015. Sorry. They also have a 6.9% unemployment rate in 2016, which is a drop from their 7.4% in 2015. Their population is estimated at not about 9 million, close to 10 in the year 2016, so a much bigger country than both Iceland and Finland. And their education expenditures show that, with a total of 7.7% of GDP, which came out to be about 38.35 billion. Also, the federal government spends 250.2 billion. Also, to get a good look at why the EU nations score so high on the EPI, we can look here, and in this map we see all these green areas are protected natural habitats in the C2. And Europe has actually one of the highest concentration of protected habitats. Even if they are fragmented, there's still a gigantic amount of them, and that goes a long way in the EPI score. Also, countries in Europe, here we have a graph of subsidy for fossil fuel industries. And no surprise, China has the biggest subsidies for fossil fuel, as they're also one of the largest emitters in the country. I think US is second. And European nations like France and Germany are extremely low fossil fuel funding. They have a lot of investment in renewable resources and alternative forms of energy. If we want to compare some of the statistics from the European nations to the United States, we can see here that the GDP for the United States was $18.56 trillion, which is way bigger than any of the European nations. Yet still, we have a much lower environmental index score. So it goes to show that the correlation isn't always perfect. Also, a 4.7 unemployment rate, which is pretty close to some of the top few, but a population that is much, much larger, of a 300 million person population, and an education expenditure of 4.9% of the GDP, which comes out to be about $900 billion. And the federal government, or federal budget of 2016 was $3.89 trillion. Currently, the United States emission policy is still the one that was placed in by Obama, and allows states to set regulations as they see fit in order to meet EPA set emission goals. This policy has proven to be less effective than that of the EU, as it does not set a single limit and leaves room for business loopholes, or loopholes that businesses can exploit.